time to talk Izzet here on Uncle Cardboard's Limited Jamboree. I'm Uncle Cardboard, Jake Brown, and we're going to be diving into the wild world of blue-red here. It is episode 3 of my 10-part series breaking down all of the Crimson Vow archetypes. We're going to get into all of the drafting, one small archetype at a time. Eventually it'll be 10 full things, and it'll be great. If you like pictures, then you can watch all of this on YouTube at bit.ly/UncleVideo. It's capital U, capital V in Uncle Video because Bitly is a lot of fun and easy to use. Yay! If you like the show, if you could take a moment and leave a review, if you're on iTunes, if you can comment on this episode wherever part of the internet you're at, it really helps new people find the show. I would be greatly appreciative. And I usually respond to comments, which is just great and not damaging for anyone's mental health is reading the comments section. No, most everybody's really cool. And I love reading your comments, especially when people have questions. We got into a debate over whether or not nurturing presence was good the other day on YouTube. There's good stuff happening. So thank you so much to everybody who's been leaving comments, and I will continue to read them. All right, Izzet. Overall strategy, we're looking at aggro spells, and this is maybe the most aggressive spells deck. Heck, it is the most aggressive spells deck that I can remember because you're really just doing 1-drops, 2-drops, and then trying to play as many cheap cantrips as you can and getting a ton of ping damage or forcing through something that's unblockable. It's really a force of nature when it comes together, and damage piles up so quickly that games your opponents thought they were in are suddenly big old W's for you. This deck also really comes together based on the synergy between its commons. You don't really need a ton of like busted rares to make this work, so it's a really nice deck to move into if maybe you took something decent in blue or red but aren't really sure what your second color is, and then you start seeing some of those tier 1 commons that can come later than they probably should be. But first, let's dive into what our top payoffs are. And this week, I'm going to exclude some of the off-color rares. Let's say, for example, Wedding Announcement is a card that does really well in this deck. However, it's been played under 500 times compared to 5,000 plus for most of the rares on this list. So we're just going to talk about kind of relevant on-color rares because that's going to be your most common use case. So number 5, Overcharged Amalgam. And this is a card that comes in and counters something. It also plays really well with your 1-drops because a lot of times you don't mind sacrificing them turn 4 or later. And this gives you a nice evasive threat in the air, so no surprise here. Number 4 is Geralf, Visionary Stitcher. Geralf can play just fine on his own. He doesn't need a whole lot of support. You don't have a ton of butts, so you're not making huge flyers, but he does have a kind of nice synergy with Bloody Betrayal. It's not required or necessarily recommended, but something to keep in mind is that there is this cool little pocket of synergy there as he is one of your cheaper sacrifice outlets in the format. Number 3, Hullbreaker Horror. Now, not a surprise to see it on this list. Surprised to see it at 3. This is a card that is uniformly busted in what we would call a pretty bomb-heavy limited format. But I think the fact that it's not the clear and unequivocal number 1 speaks to how fast this deck is. A lot of times, if I have 7 lands in play and I have an Izzet deck, I am nervous. That is not where you're trying to be. So something to keep in mind. You're always playing Dream or Hullbreaker Horror, but it doesn't play quite as busted as it does in some other decks. Number 2, we have Dream Shacklegeist, and this is truly the dream card for this deck because it plays well with your tempo cards where you're just trying to tie something down and maybe chip in with some of your, earlier drops, and it's an evasive threat. It's pretty much all that you want. It also means that if they play larger creatures, that you're not just straight up dying to them. And then number 1, game in hand win rate for any rare or mythic in Izzet is Stensia Uprising. Yes, you heard that right. This is a card that people still pass to me, which blows my mind, but look at it this way is that you're doing so much early damage through all of these pings that eventually 7 damage is just going to end the game on the spot. So Sensia Uprising is your number one payoff for being an Izzet spells. When we look at our on-color rare in Aerith Tormented Prophet, it clocks in at number 7, which is totally respectable. I think in general, it wants to play a longer game and you're going to be able to eke value over time. I'm really nervous dropping it on turn 3 a lot of games because you're just not going to be able to get as many spells out as you want. We're coming back from a really gross burp that I just edited out because I'm your friend. All right, so when it comes to exiling spells early, a lot of your cheap spells are drawing you cards, and exiling a Reckless Impulse to, exile even more cards, and then you hit an Ancestral Anger, and you're like, there's just too much going on here, and I don't have the mana to cast it all. It just feels bad. So I think it's fine, but you're just looking to play a little bit longer game when you include it. Now, normally in this series, I would start talking about Signpost uncommons, but I think that the tier 1 commons are so foundational to what this deck wants to do. There's no way we can really discuss further without talking about them. I've already kind of had to hint at what they are, so I just want to get them out of the way, and then we can really talk about where we go from there. The tier 1 commons are unequivocally, and in no particular order, Abrade, which is, solid, cheap removal. Flame Blessed Bolt, arguably cheaper, no, definitely cheaper, but also really strong, cheap interaction, which this format values a ton and this deck loves. Lantern Bearer, which is going to chip in for damage, you can sacrifice the body later, and then sometimes you'll just give something flying for lethal. Ancestral Anger, which I really consider the engine of this deck, and if you can get up to 4 or 5 of them, it feels unbeatable. And Kestic Flame Breather, which is your other part of the engine. And once you get 2 or 3 down on the board, giving your Ancestral Angers all and, get a bolt to the face of your opponent feels so good. So those are kind of your core commons. And I'm also going to include as an honorable mention Wedding Invitation. And this is a bit of a surprise. It wasn't even a card that people were considering for the first 2 weeks of the format, so we didn't have any data on it. It's been tier 1 for 5 out of the last 6 weeks, though, and one of the best commons. So when you consider it, it is another cantrip, which plays really well with what our theme is. It gets a trigger off of Kestic Flame Breather, and it makes something unblockable. So sometimes you're just going to have a Falconwrath Celebrants on your top end that it's going to get in for free, and it'll gain you some life. So I definitely want to note that is kind of this card that doesn't really, we don't have great data on it because people didn't get it early on. In terms of all of the tier 1s that I mentioned, these are 8 out of 8 weeks. We're above average rate. They're just flat out good. Then cards that are just missing out of tier 1, they're like tier 1.5, are Voldaren Epicure, which again, cheap creature that you can get in some chip damage with. It gives you a blood token, which is great because sometimes you're just pitching stuff. You don't need it. You also get Chill of the Grave in this next tier, which I think is critical because, again, cantrip, but it also gives you an opportunity to really lock down an opposing threat for a couple combats worth, and that can be the difference in a race. And then finally, Scattered Thoughts for the times when you just need to draw 4 cards and then get rid of 2. In tier 2, we have Falconwrath Celebrants, which is a card that I think is fine, but not necessarily necessary. You have games where instead of spending 5 mana on a 1/4/4 creature, you'd rather cast 2 or 3 spells and get a bunch of Flame Breather triggers, and that's fine, but you're never bummed to cast Celebrants. Also in tier 2 is Reckless Impulse, which is going to just give this deck some velocity. I like it a little bit less than Scattered Thoughts, but it's a good card. Syncopate, which helps you answer some of those larger threats and is a little bit better than Siphon Essence because it doesn't require as much mana, so you can sometimes just get away with casting it for a blue and a colorless. And then finally, Bloody Betrayal. And Bloody Betrayal is interesting. I first heard about this from Sam Black, that there, with the number of cheap exploit creatures that you have, sometimes Stitched Assistant and Bloody Betrayal is just 6 mana, like kind of take over a game. You're going to steal their creature. You're going to get in a profitable attack, usually, because they don't want to kill their creature. And then you cast Stitched Assistant. You get to trade that creature in for a scry and a card and be left with a 3/2 and a blood from Bloody Betrayal. Like, all in all, great deal. So I think that that's kind of a corner case in terms of decks that you should be going after. When that deck comes together, it's because you're getting Bloody Betrayal as like a 14th pick. So there's nothing really that you're giving up to get it. And then you just wind up with a critical mass of exploiters that you're also getting super late because people aren't Demir or they just don't like that deck. So in tier 3, we're playing cards like Siphon Essence, Repository Scob, Alchemist Retrieval, Cruel Witness, and Stitched Assistant. They're all fine. I don't feel like we have a whole lot that we need to discuss with them. So moving on. I want to talk about one overrated card right now, and that is Blood Petal Celebrant. It's finished above average only once in 8 weeks, but it's been played 19,000 times so far, compared to a little over 20,000 for Voldaren Epicure. And it's just a much better card. I think people are like, this just slots in well to my 2-drop slot, so I'm going for it. I don't really think that Blood Petal Celebrant is the slam dunk a lot of people consider it. I certainly don't want multiples in any deck. If I'm looking for multiples, I'll just speculate on a late Wretched Throng. And then sometimes just being able to put a Throng in your hand to discard to blood is a ton of value in this deck. Whereas Blood Petal Celebrant just maybe like eventually getting you a blood token, not as good. In terms of an underrated card, I think I would just kind of reiterate Chill of the Grave as a card that people are missing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And also just Alchemist Retrieval probably too. It ranks a little bit better than people would expect, and it bounces real and spectacular in this deck. So those are our overrated, underrated. Broadly, is one color where the Signpost Uncommon is just dead on with what we're trying to do in Wandering Mind. It's cheap, it's evasive, it nets you a spell every time. I've never managed to whiff on this. It's possible, but not if you've built your deck correctly. It's just really everything that you're looking for from this little freak. So I'm windmill slamming Wandering Mind. And right now it's that card where people are a little afraid to commit to colors initially on that gold card. So you're getting them like pick 6, 7-ish, and great time to move in. On the flip side, I think Lambholt Raconteur is one of your biggest traps. Here's my issue with Lambholt Raconteur, is that it really only plays well for you if you can flip it tonight, right? Because otherwise it's just a beefier flame breather and whatever, you don't care. It doesn't matter. If you can get it for 2 damage reliably, great. But here's your problem, is that a lot of your cheap spells are playing at sorcery speed. Your Ancestral Angers, your Reckless Impulses, your Wedding Invitation. Like, a lot of the things that you want to be doing happen at instant speed, so it's hard as hell to flip it over, and then you're pretty much immediately going to double spell and flip it back. So it's, I think, one of those cards that people are like, well, it makes sense, but I think that it's currently being overrated in terms of payoffs. I'd rather have like Whispering Wizard way before this, and that this is really falling for me in like 22nd, 23rd card category. I want velocity. I want to be moving a lot faster at that point of the game, as opposed to taking a turn off for a Raconteur. Also, just Frenzied Devils is a card that never worked. Don't play it. It actually has a negative 2.4% improvement when drawn rate, meaning that you're giving up opportunities to win a game when you cast Frenzied Devils. So it looks like it says the word spells. That's a trap. Don't get trapped. Your biggest hole in this deck is being able to answer big threats. This deck is certainly fast, but it does not do well racing something like Flourishing Hunter, which is going to gain your opponent some life when it comes down and then just start bashing you. And all of your damage-based removal really tops out at 5 damage, so when you're looking at what you're most commonly going to be playing in Abrade and Flame Blast Bolt, they just don't have a strong way to deal with a card like, I don't know, Hookhand Mariner, for example. So you need to have ways to be able to keep up in a race, or at least delay what your opponent's doing. And I mean, there's a reason that the top 2 uncommons by game in hand win rate in this deck are Lunar Rejection and Rending Flame. You need a way to deal with threats, either to hit for 5 damage, so you're taking out kind of those mid-range threats, or just delay what their plan's trying to do, especially when you're talking about werewolves. Lunar Rejection is chef's kiss amazing with that. That's also part of the reason why I really like Chill of the Grave. I'm confident having it in that tier 1.5. You are just often going to be able to get there in a race off of the back of Chill, and it's doing cantrippy things like Lunar Rejection, which is exactly where you want to be. And then for our only sub-theme, that's the Steal and Exploit, which we already spoke about. You're really not, don't force that. Don't force it. It should come naturally because the cards are available later in the packs. Okay, that has been our breakdown for Izzet. Stay tuned. Next episode, let's do Simic. Why not? We'll do a color pair that I feel like a lot of people struggled with early on, and we'll check out and see exactly how it's going to work. If you like the show, please share it with friends, post it in a Discord, do all of the things that I can't do because it would be shameless self-promotion. And I will see you back for episode 4, Simic, tomorrow. We'll talk Simic tomorrow. Goodbye. Hey everybody, it's your favorite uncle, reminding you to check out the Open Draft Project, where I sit down with your favorite pros, streamers, and limited grinders. They do the exact same draft seed, and then we see what's going on in their heads. If you are brand new to draft, or you're like me and draft way too much, there's always something that you can take away from this series where we talk to some of the greatest draft minds in the world. Check it out.